Welcome back, class. We're going to talk in the second segment about government and how they actually balance their budget or how they don't balance their budget. And when you're looking at the budget for a government, it's basically revenue minus expenditures equals a balanced budget. If you think about theory of the firm and profit maximization, you're looking at a similar thing. You're looking at revenue minus expenditures drives profit. So depending on which one has the greater magnitude, you're either going to get a profit, you're going to get a loss. And when you're looking at the government, it's a similar thing. You're either going to get a budget surplus or a budget deficit, or sometimes you actually get kind of a budget neutral. So the budget is, truly balanced. So a budget surplus is a situation that occurs if the government revenues exceed expenses. Makes sense? A budget deficit, a situation that occurs if the government expenditures exceed revenues. So the function is going to end up with a negative amount. A balanced budget is the situation that occurs if the budget surplus equals zero. So if the budget surplus equals zero, then you have a balanced budget. Or another way of looking at it, if revenues minus expenditures equals zero, it's a balanced budget. If you, governments sometimes will increase tax cuts to drive deficits. And if you increase tax cuts to try to generate the economy, to try to shift that aggregate demand curve out, you may end up with deficits. If you increase government spending, what can happen? You could also increase the potential or the probability of a budget deficit. The national debt is a sum of all past federal deficits minus any surpluses. Our government debt, the last numbers I looked at were something like $33.85 trillion. And I'm sure it's going up. I'm sure that ticker continues to go up. So basically what that's saying is we've had more deficits than we've had surpluses. Congress authorizes the maximum amount of federal debt borrowing. And that's what you end up with. And we're getting ready to have, at least in theory, have a federal government shutdown. Had 35 days when Trump was the president, when we were trying to get the border wall built. But Congress has to balance the budget and has to determine what the budget is. And, Republicans, Democrats, it's got to be bipartisan, agreed upon. And if they can't come up with a balanced budget, and I'm not even sure what the new date is that they have to have that, balanced budget in place. It just keeps slipping. It was supposed to be, I guess, a late summer, early fall, and it just keeps slipping and slipping. And now it's probably sometime mid-January. You've got things like in the past, you had things like COVID. COVID impacted spending within the United States, and it was, it had a definite impact on trying to get the budget balanced. You've got now the things that are facing. Let's try to remember some. Ukraine, talking about some more money. Ukraine, talking about some monetary support for Israel. You've got the migrants coming in over the southern border. Those are probably the big three that's driving the issues with the balanced budget. And then the authors get into when they want to talk about the use of fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. And again, when they're talking about stabilizing the economy, they're talking about, managing recessionary gaps, inflationary gaps, trying to keep the economy stabilized and moving forward at a positive rate. And the use of government expenditures, taxes to influence the level of economic activity. They also talk about used to close inflationary and recessionary gaps that we talked about. So they're driving government expenditures, driving taxes to influence the level of economic activity. And one thing that the author spent a little bit of time talking about, they jumped into something called automatic stabilizers. And an automatic stabilizer is government expenditures and taxation policies automatically work to insulate individuals from the impact of shocks to the economy. And again, it sounds somewhat redundant, but when they talk about economic stabilizers, they kick in automatically when there are shocks to the economy. And one of those economic stabilizers that the authors talk about are transfer payments. And again, we talked about transfer payments earlier in this actual chapter, plus in some of the earlier chapters. But we talked about it when we were talking about government expenditures. And more people eligible for income supplements when income is falling. So especially in a recessionary period or a recessionary gap, when you have income falling, you have more individuals that are applying for these transfer payments. It reduces the effect of a change in real GDP on disposable income, pushing some money into the system. It insulates households from impact of recession. People pay less taxes as incomes fall. So kind of a snowball effect. Recessionary, people either lose jobs or having to cut back on the number of hours they work. Maybe their real wage has fallen. And as incomes fall, you're going to generate fewer personal income taxes on those falling incomes. And again, talk about an automatic stabilizer. Any government program that tends to reduce fluctuations in GDP automatically. Tend to increase GDP when it is falling and decrease GDP when it's rising. 1990 to 1991 is one of the examples that the authors give, when the government was reducing tax payments, but they were increasing transfer payments. You have more unemployment benefits. You have more what they call mean-tested federal transfer payments. As income starts to change, they both go to work. Again, means tested. That's basically saying there are certain income parameters that you have to meet or have income levels less than those parameters to be available or to secure these transfer payments. It directly impacts personal disposable income. Disposable income linked to changes in consumption. So what's happening on these automatic stabilizers as individuals, especially households, as income starts to go down, they are kicking in, and through transfer payments, they're trying to mitigate the fluctuations in personal income, especially personal disposable income. And income, especially disposable income, is linked to consumption. So for the most part, as your personal disposable income starts to go down, individuals, especially households, tend to cut back on consumption. And it reduces the degree of changes to the real GDP. So you've got these automatic stabilizers that are going to kick in based on changes to GDP, based on disposable income in households, because they're trying to mitigate the fluctuations in the economic growth of any given country. And so within the federal government, you've got, especially on fiscal policy, you've got these automatic stabilizers that are going to kick in when especially households, individuals and households are facing an impact from a shock to the economy. So automatic stabilizers, and then secondarily, you've got discretionary fiscal policy tools. And they are a deliberate government effort to stabilize the economy via fiscal policy. because they're trying to shift the aggregate demand. They're trying to keep that, they're trying to keep the economy growing, and they're trying to shift that aggregate demand. Increase government purchases, increase transfer payments, decrease taxes, and that's what's considered expansionary, and it shifts the aggregate demand to the right. If you decrease government purchases, you decrease transfer payments, if you increase taxes, that's called contractionary, and that's going to shift the aggregate demand to the left. So remember, aggregate demand is downward sloping. If it's expansionary, it's going to shift it out to the right, or it's going to shift it upward. If it's contractionary, it's going to shift it to the left or shift it downward. And it's they can either be solely or they can be in combination as they attempt to shift the aggregate demand curve. Both approaches attempt to line up with real GDP with potential GDP. So they're trying to get the real GDP to line up with the potential GDP. And then the authors spend quite a bit of time talking about changes in government purchases, changes in business taxes, changes in income taxes, and changes in transfer payments. So those are kind of the key concepts that they are, at least the authors are focused on when it comes to fiscal policy and the text. And they do a pretty good job walking everybody through these changes in fiscal policies. An increase in government spending shifts the aggregate demand to the right. So it shifts it out to the right by an amount equal to the initial change in government purchases times the multiplier. Again, we've talked about the multiplier in the past. Government purchases drives increase in income, and higher income drives consumption. So that's what they're after, driving consumption. So the same increase in aggregate demand absorbed by higher prices, GDP does not rise by the full amount of the aggregate demand shift. So the shift in aggregate demand, some of that shift is absorbed in higher prices. So GDP does not rise by the full amount of the aggregate demand shift. So that was increase in government purchases. Now we're going to talk about increase in business taxes. Leaves more money in the spender's pockets. An investment tax credit is intended to stimulate private sector investment. Think about it. If you get a credit and you're a profit maximizing entity, it's going to stimulate, or it could stimulate, private sector investment. Think about solar panels, think about electronic vehicles, green energy, home improvements. A lot of those investments, you've got a investment tax credit for the most part on your federal income taxes, but to some state and local income taxes, you've got some tax credits applied to that also. An increase in investment shifts aggregate demand to the right by the amount of the investment credit times the multiplier. And tax credits impacts corporate taxes and personal taxes. Again, remember, corporations, especially S-corps, are going to be double dipped by taxes. You've got the corporation tax and the dividends that flow through to the shareholders are going to be taxed again by the personal tax rate. Changes in income taxes. If you increase income taxes, it's going to what? To disposable income. If you increase income taxes, it's going to decrease the disposable income, and it's going to decrease consumption, and it's going to negatively impact aggregate demand, right? You make X number of dollars, and whether it's the federal, whether it's state, whether it's local income taxes, if you increase income taxes, it's just going to automatically decrease your disposable income and going to have a negative impact on consumption. The last one, or number 4, is changes in transfer payments. And think about just kind of when you're talking about whether it's changes in government purchases, changes in business taxes, changes in personal income taxes, changes in transfer payments, just think about it. If you need to, draw out a little aggregate demand aggregate supply curve, and think about what the impact of one of these 4 would do to it. So again, we're talking about changes now in transfer payments. If you increase transfer payments, what does that do to disposable income? Increases disposable income. What does that do to consumption? Increases consumption, shifts the aggregate demand curve. So more transfer payments flowing into the system or into the economy, let's call it. More transfer payments flowing into the economy, it's going to increase individuals' personal income that have been tested to receive these transfer payments, and it's going to increase their consumption patterns. Consumption may change by a bit less because individuals tend to do what with some of their income? They tend to save some. They tend to put some aside, especially if you have mean tested for the transfer payments. You're probably in a situation that you need that income. Lost your job, the economy's bottomed out, got hurt at work. A lot of negative occurrences to your ability to drive income for you and maybe your family. And so you have gone through the mean testing process, and you can qualify. Let's use the term qualify. You can qualify for these transfer payments, and as you receive these transfer payments, you're thinking about, and I can't remember. I've never been on unemployment taxes, but or unemployment payments, but unemployment payments they're not infinite. I want to say they're like 16, 18 months in duration. So if you're looking at drawing unemployment payments in a particular state, you're again looking at transfer payments, and they're not going to last forever. So you may be putting aside some of that money for a rainy day when those payments run out. And at that point, we're going to stop for a few minutes, and when we come back, we're going to talk about fiscal policy and practice. Remember, when we talked about monetary policy, there were some, complications and issues with monetary policy. Now we're going to look at fiscal policy and practice, and we'll see if we run into some of those similar complications or drawbacks to fiscal policy. Talk to everybody in a few minutes.